Welcome back for another episode of Stupid Crap You Shouldn't Do as a Therapist If You Want to Keep Your License, which I am immediately renaming Therapist Gone Wild for the remainder of this series. I don't know what I was thinking at the beginning. Anyway, today I bring you an associate social worker from California. In the middle of the pandemic, they began working with a minor 17-year-old client over Zoom. Now, about half a year into the treatment, the therapist decided to call the client, which on its own is not necessarily problematic. Maybe they were just checking in. That's certainly what the client thought. However, as the conversation progressed, it started to get stranger and stranger. With the client reporting they were feeling increasingly uncomfortable, but the therapist was not allowing them to end the call. The client says that the therapist started telling them that they had, quote, lost connection with the outside world, that they were neglected, that they were unloved. The therapist then threatened to send the child's father to jail for failing to pay child support, and then told the child that their parents had lied to them about the real reason for their divorce. Told the child that they had an eating disorder, that they were anemic, that they were bipolar just like their cousin, that their sexuality was different and that they were really bisexual. Then they asked the client whether or not they knew how to, quote, kill the right people, followed by threatening to put them in a 72-hour psychiatric hold and force food down their throat. Then the therapist switched gears, telling them that the client was theirs forever and they would never leave them. And then said the client was a baby and started to sing them lullabies, asking the client to sing along. At some point in this 3.5-hour ordeal, the client heard the therapist get into their car, and the therapist indicated that they were coming over to the client's home. It was at this point that the client texted their mom in fear, asking for help. Mom quickly told work they had an emergency and rushed home. When mom did arrive home, they found the client crying on the phone, listened in, and eventually told the therapist this was inappropriate, that they no longer required their services, and ended the call. And in case this wasn't enough, and by the way, most of this was admitted to by the therapist saying that they were, quote, irrational on the phone, a year later, the therapist ended up having another incident unrelated to this on the pier. In this incident, they got into an altercation with two people on the pier and at some point stole one of their backpacks and a knife and threatened to stab them to death. Needless to say, when the police showed up, they eventually arrested the therapist. And again, the therapist admitted to the truth of all of these things. So this is not a case of a false accusation that the therapist denied. They have since relinquished their license and are no longer practicing psychotherapy in the state. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you at the next episode of Therapist Gone Wild.